computer, yes. So, okay, good. So, whoops, all right, so last time we left off, we were talking about the levels of attention, and hopefully you were able to read those things, as you went through the different chapters, and those levels of attention are very important in relationship to understanding what he calls, the blind spot. So let me just go back to that for 1 second. So the important thing here is that as you look at yourselves within an organization, and even you look at leadership, that one is, again, you act from the center of the organization. And generally what happens there, again, is that's where a lot of downloading comes from, because that's how I see the world. That's what I believe in, and that's it. So that's what it's all about. Then as you move into expanding your attention, you then move to the periphery and at least begin to look out there that, yeah, there might be some other points of view. There might be other things that we need to look at. And then finally, or not finally, but the third level he talks about is where you now begin to act outside of the boundaries. So you do go out, you do learn from other people, you do learn from other groups, you begin to explore other possibilities. And then finally, the level of attention then is where you collectively, with many different people or different organizations, is where you're acting from the emerging spheres across one's organizational boundaries. So this can happen within an organization also. So for example, in higher education or even in the K-12 environment, what you see, particularly at the high school level, where you have departments, and many times those departments are locked in those boundaries and we don't move across it. Now, with the emergence of like STEAM or STEM environments or maker labs, what you're beginning to see now is this concept of, well, yeah, we do have to start working across boundaries. We do have to start looking at how information interacts, how science interacts with mathematics, and mathematics interacts with art and music, and how music interacts with science, etc. So again, the levels of attention, particularly starting with yourself on how you look at things, and then begin to understand that in relationship to leadership and how you move an organization through these levels in order to get people to move beyond the downloading becomes very important. So just want to make sure that you have a pretty good handle on that as you go through, particularly this week, as I have you reading the area around the language of the social fields or the grammar of the social fields. So this is an important concept to think about. And it's also going to be one that next week when we get into talking about your interview process, that these are important for you to learn how to interview, probably at that third level, acting from beyond one's organizational boundary. And the other thing is, when you're doing the interview of a leader, you want to see how possibly they have their own attention in terms of themselves and in relationship to their organization. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. If not, or right now, those of you online, do you have any questions about that? Or is that fairly clear and something that has to percolate for a while, in your mind? Okay, so now what we were moving into then is what Sharma talks about is this concept of divides. And I think why I'm finding this quite interesting and why I wanted to kind of carry this on a little bit past last week is, given the environment in which we're living in right now, I think his determination of looking at these concepts of divides are very important. And what he talks about in relationship to three divides, and I actually think there's a fourth divide that we need to think about also. But in terms of his typology, he sees this idea of the ecological divide is that of being the type of divide that really is, how do I deal with nature? And as he says there, the history of this planet, how the impact of human beings on this planet is that right now, that 1.5 basically means that our consumption and waste is much more than the planet is able to sustain, and that we're basically at the level of at least 1.5. Some people already think is that we really are at the level of consumption on this planet, that we're consuming 2 times the amount of resources that this planet has. So what he talks about is our ability to think about ourselves in relationship to our place on the earth. And then you go back and think about the overview video, that this is what he's getting at, that this dichotomy between self and nature does create a lot of tension. And you can see that playing out in politics, you can see that playing out around the world, but he feels that this is an extremely important divide that we need to begin to understand. And as educators, I think that these 3 divides are extremely important for us to look at. So the second one that he defines is basically this idea of the social divide. And here he's looking at us in relationship to self and others. And so this number 2.5 is a very important one, because out of the 7.2 billion people that are on this planet right now, is that about 2.5 billion of them are living in very severe poverty. Now that's starting to get a little bit better because of some of the activities that the UN particularly is dealing with, but it says basically is that more than 80% of the world's population, in countries where the income differential is widening, and within our own country, the discussion between the top 1% and the rest of the folks in this country has been a major issue related to our political discussion. So what he's talking about is that our understanding about, besides ourselves with the planet, but how we interact with other human beings and how they play out economically, politically, any type of social organizations, are things that we need to begin to discuss, we need to begin to think about, because they are very critical in relationship to the way in which we act. In a couple minutes, I'm going to have you hear Otto talk about that, because this again is something that is important to us as educators, particularly as we think about the design of what schooling needs to be, what type of information and what type of activities are we integrating into our curriculum. And then the last one he talks about from his point of view, which is a very interesting one, is this one that he calls the spiritual cultural divide. And really what he's looking at with this, and number 3 you'll see in a second, is this idea of self to self. And basically what that number 3 stands for, and as you can read this, hopefully in terms of the size of it, is that really there are 3 times more deaths from suicide in the world, as opposed to all of the activities that are related to natural disasters, accidents, or wars. And that right now, since there are 3 times more suicides, that is a symptom of what's going on in terms of the burnout, the depression, and this inability, as he says, to cope with understanding who we are as individuals and the actions that we have to carry out in our own daily lives. And I always use the example that I remember when I heard Otto first talk about this, that about 2 weeks later, when I would take SEPTA into Philadelphia, all of a sudden I started seeing in every SEPTA station suicide prevention hotline numbers because of the number of people who have committed suicide jumping in front of trains. And I know even out in this nice, pristine area of Lancaster County, that the newspapers have been really having a lot of articles related to the number of people who have attempted to jump off of, I think it's the 4th or 5th story of the downtown parking garage trying to commit suicide, and their attempt to deal with that by putting fences up, etc. So it's something that he talks about in relationship to begin to understand what this theory U is about, and the concept of self to nature, self to others, and self to self. The only other one I'm adding, and I think is very important, I'd add a 4th divide, and that is self to automation and technology, because that is an emerging area that will have very, very interesting ramifications, particularly in relationship to self to others and self to self. And we'll talk about that in some later Zooms. So with that, I'm going to show you a short clip of him talking about these divides. He's going to be putting them in an economic content, but I want you to think about them in relationship to what you've been reading so far, but also in context of what we see going on in the world today. So also, if you have not muted your mic, please do so you don't get feedback in terms of the video as it comes on.
In this clip, I'm going to talk about the current transformation of capitalism, which is the transformation of business, society, and self. And I'm going to introduce you to a diagnostic tool that will help you to make sense of some of the deeper systemic structures and blind spots that keep us collectively reenacting results that no one wants. So here's kind of the first step. We'll use an iceberg model, and you have seen iceberg models many times, and it starts with a very simple distinction, which is there's like 10% visible above the waterline, and then there's another 90% that is below the waterline. So if we start with that, what is it that we see above the waterline? In some of the earlier clips, I talked about 3 types of problem clusters. I talked about the ecological divide, the social divide, and the spiritual divide. And what I mean with ecological divide is a disconnect between self and nature that shows up in many forms of environmental destruction, of resource scarcity, of falling water tables, of climate change, and of soil erosion that we see going on worldwide. And if you want to put a number on the ecological divide, that number is 1.5. Today, we operate a world economy that uses 1.5 planet Earth. We use 1.5 times the regeneration capacity of planet Earth. So that's kind of the big problem here. And it's not going to go away. It's going to get worse. And we need something to do about that. We all know that. Now, what's the second problem here? The social divide. What I mean with social divide is a disconnect between self and other. And that disconnect shows up in many different forms of social polarization, of fragmentation, of conflicts, of violence, of inequity, and of poverty. In the United States, the top 1% own more than the bottom 90% combined. And worldwide, we all kind of live in a situation where I feel that we live on a very thin and fragile layer of order that could break up any moment, and in fact is breaking up at an increasing rate, both in the global south and in the global north. So that's number 2. But then here's a third one. And the third one basically has to do, the spiritual divide has to do with a disconnect between self and self. And what I mean with disconnect between self and self is a disconnect between who I am today and who I could be tomorrow, between my current self and my emerging future self or my essential self. And if those two selves are no longer talking and listening to each other, what is it that we see? We see increasing rates of burnout, of depression, and of suicide. In 2010, worldwide, more people killed themselves in suicide than were being killed through war, murder, and natural disasters combined. So in spite of all the violence going on in the world, more people kill themselves than are being killed through others. It's a shocking number we have here. And it reminds us, although we don't talk about the spiritual divide, it is as important and as significant than the other two divides that are, of course, much more visible to us. So those are like three big issues that we are dealing with. And we face these issues across all societies really today. The question is, how have we been responding to these issues? Because these are not new issues. They're around for 100+ years. And if we look back to the 20th century, here's how we have responded. In government, we create one or several ministries kind of for each of these problem clusters. In international organizations, we create one or several UN organizations for each of these clusters. In NGO, we create special single-focus NGOs on environmental issues, on social issues, and on cultural issues. And of course, in academia, we have for each of these issues one or several departments. That's how we have been responding. Basically, silo type of approaches that address the problem at the symptom level, not at the root level. And that largely miss the interdependency across these problems. But the question is, when you look at this, what really is below the waterline? What are some of these deeper systemic issues that keep us reenacting these types of problems time and again? And before I move on, I want to give you a minute to take a pen, to take a piece of paper, and to write down what is your answer, kind of what is your kind of current thinking about what are some of these deeper systemic issues? What do you think is it that makes us collectively today worldwide reenacting results that nobody wants? Think about your top 3 root issues that you believe are at the source of us collectively creating results that nobody wants.
So with that, what I'm going to ask you is, what are some of your initial thoughts about hearing about these divides and what Otto was saying?
I think I agree with my thoughts and Jack. I think that we also have a huge time problem to
Can you? Yeah, your mic is like you're coming across like. Sorry. So others, thoughts? What about this?
Dr. Gould, an interesting factor that came to mind when he was, well, even when you were talking about self and self. So I know I'm a little bit unique compared to the rest of my classmates in that I'm more healthcare more so than education. But, and I saw, I think Buck posted too about, all the deaths with drugs and heroin and everything. So I'm part of our drug diversion investigation team within the hospital. So what that is anytime a healthcare worker diverts drugs in some kind of mechanism, and this year we doubled our numbers in diversions with a nurse trying to divert drugs. And I think it's just a lot of stress with what's going on in the world. And I think life in itself is just harder. I don't know. I mean, the best way to put it into words, but, we've seen quite a few nurses, male, female, nothing in particular, that have resorted to, taking prescription drugs from the hospital, whether it's for themselves or to sell them on the streets or, whatever they end up doing. But an interesting factor from a conference that I had gone to is 1 in 4 nurses will divert drugs at some point in their life through their career. I thought was a pretty confounding number compared to the amount of nurses in the field. So it's just interesting, all the stressors that, go on and with work and life, that I think maybe that's something that people use to escape from.
Yeah, interesting point. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about, I know in Lancaster County in central Pennsylvania, particularly opioid addiction, is just all over the place. And what you're seeing more and more now, law enforcement, doctors, community schools starting to get together, and more people are talking about it because of the amount of opioids that are just present at all ages, actually, which gets into what he's talking about, self to self, that burnout, that depression of what we're seeing going on. And it's also, just real quick, it's very interesting. I was looking at some data that was showing that, in the Rust Belt states particularly, the opioid epidemic in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, all of those states that are considered Rust Belt, it's through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, it's really something that we need to think about. Others? Okay, Nicole, I have your chat up here. Okay, yeah. So, and the other thing is that as we think about this from a leadership point of view, and whether you're in the educational environment, if you're in a non-educational environment outside of education, those of you who are in education, and I'm particularly looking at K-12, is that the need to begin to understand what these concepts are, and then how do they impact the design of what we're doing in relationship to what we're teaching, and how we're teaching kids, and what type of learning environments are we creating for them. That does the old model still make sense, particularly if you think about going down the U and how you can create empathetic conversation. That one of the bigger issues we're dealing with today, as people talk about how divided this country is, and it's divided into bubbles. And the ability to not, seek outside of my bubble or my frame of reference is a major contributing factor to the fact that we're all locked into, our point of view, as opposed to being willing to listen to someone else's point of view.
When he asked about what's under the iceberg, I immediately thought greed, fear, and hate. It's those things that make all of those divides.
Yeah, they're powerful. And they're also tied into not the presencing concept of going down the U, it's tied into that absencing model that he has. And we'll be talking about that also in our next Zoom So absenting is, that's the one where you get locked into the downloading, and then you move, down into the point of view is that I am who I am, basically, and that's it, and the heck with everybody else. And that seems to be very prevalent today. So in his comments where he's showing self to others, and you think about what he was showing there, and you just think about what's going on politically in this country, particularly, with what happened over the weekend, with now all this mass protesting that's starting to take place, is that we're in a very, very, unique time, relationship. This, I remember, back in the 60s when the Vietnam War was going on and when civil rights was going on, how these protests were there. But recently, the amount of protesting that has emerged out of this even is dwarfing what I think took place back in the late 60s and early 70s.
Dr. Gold, do you think that because kind of the pendulum shifts the other way, that now if you look at protests, that's kind of getting out of that silo model, that people are coming together more, that it goes from one extreme to the other and now it's swinging back in the other direction?
Yeah, it's interesting because, the reason that you're starting to see this from the left, so let's just look at it from the left, is that if you remember a week after Obama was elected, that's when the Tea Party started, and they did the same thing, except what's bizarre about it is it wasn't as pronounced in the media the way this is right now. So yeah, I think it is. It's a shifting or a learning from one side that was never really engaged to now becoming very engaged with it.
But with the Tea Party, did they have the numbers that they're getting for these type of protests? And then on the other hand, too, they didn't see the international reaction that they're seeing now. I mean, when you talk about the siloing effect, you're seeing people on an international scale, countries, European countries, Australia, it kind of is what it might be as bad as what's happening here. It's really bringing the global community together, which is kind of an interesting view of it.
And what's the vehicle for that?
It's fear.
Now, but there's something else, the vehicle that allows it to happen.
I mean, technology right now is really bringing them all together.
Yeah, and it's funny because the Tea Party, when I remember how that was going, it was using social media, but not the way social media is being used today. I mean, it's instantaneous. It's the whole, it doesn't matter what side you're on. The social media is what's initiating this. So you think about the Women's March back last week. That started how? It's amazing how that took place. What happened?
A Facebook post.
Yeah, by a lady in where? Hawaii.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, how many people were there? And then before you know it, look what happened. So that's the point. I think it's more energized. But the question is, if you listen to what Otto said there, he said, this is a fundamental shift. And if you remember the beginning of the book where he's talking about that there's really, seismic shifts that have been taking place ever since the Berlin Wall came down. And I remember when that came down. Sure, I don't know how old you guys were when that came down in the 90s. That was amazing what started happening because the Berlin Wall. Yeah, I as a kid growing up, was always fearful of having nuclear war over East Berlin. I remember the Berlin blockade. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, we almost came to nuclear war back in the early 60s because of that process. So the impact of what's driving these things is very interesting. That now we're seeing a total social consciousness, like he talks about, is emerging, but there's a reaction to it when you think about the conservative, just use these labels for the time being, conservative versus liberal. So you're seeing this we mentioned the word Hegelian. Hegel talked about these ups and downs of history. It's almost we're in the middle of it, but it's exacerbated by social media because of instantaneous flow of information. So we're living in very interesting times, to say the least. So any other comments about, what you saw in terms of the divides, because I think it's important for you to think about those. And as I said, when you get into 802, the one dealing with technology, I think that's where that other divide begins to come into play, because the relationship to us as people and automation and technology is having major impacts on us right now. And like I said, a lot of people don't realize, we're talking about trade deals and all those things, but the real impact to job loss is not, that's part of it, but it's not all that, it's automation. And so, the loss of these, quote, and I'll put it this way, the lower skilled types of work that with the factory model work, it's not there anymore. It's gone. I think about Hershey. Hershey, Pennsylvania has a factory there that I believe 90 to 95% of it is done through automation. Very few people work in that factory. So it's there. I mean, it's that old factory industrial model is not there. And that again raises issues that we have to think about in terms of us as educators in what we're doing, because quite frankly, those of you in higher ed are going to start feeling it in a very interesting way very quickly because of return on investment, whether or not, the 4-year degree makes any sense anymore. I mean, I'm not talking about education doesn't make sense, continuous learning doesn't make sense, but does the old model of a degree make sense anymore, in the world of MOOCs and badges and certifications and all those things. Okay, so I think that's some interesting information for you to think about. And what I want to do is just finish up with these last couple slides to add to this, just to think about. Let me get to, oops, I want to share this. And go to that, whoa, here we go. So,
in this clip, I'm going
oops, no, we're not going to do that. We're done, Otto. Go to the next one. So some concluding thoughts I'd like to just think about is, as we look at this, is that, as it says here, basically that communication is essential to healthy relationships. But, we also end up telling them what we think they need to know. And this is leading into what's going to happen next week when we talk about the way to do interviews. That the question is, in the process, then we miss an opportunity to build relationships based on curiosity and interest in the other person. So our tendency is, because we're taught, to debate, we're taught to, as we're listening to somebody, come up with a different point of view or my point of view, that in generative listening, you don't do that. What you're really trying to do is to truly listen to what the other person is saying to understand them. So as Edgar Schein says, if I feel I have something to learn from you or want to hear you, from your own experiences or feeling, because I care for you and need something from you to accomplish a task, this makes me temporarily dependent upon or vulnerable to you. And I'm going to tell you, when you do this interview, and hopefully you downloaded those 2 documents that I had for you to start at least looking at the protocol for the interview, is that what you're going to try to do is to suspend your assumptions, your thoughts as you're listening to that person, and allow their conversation to take you into a place so you can understand who they are. So this is what I want you to think about, and you should have these on the slide, these thoughts. And then the last thing really, think about is that, so then the core capacity needed to access the field of the future is presence. And really, presencing is when you're down at the bottom of the U, where you're letting go to let come in. And as he talks about it, remember, the eye of the needle, threading the eye of the needle. And so understanding presence and the possibility for a larger field of change only comes from many different perspectives. So the emerging sciences on living systems, as I gave you guys who had me in 800, is very important, from creative arts, because the creative arts comes from the open heart side. It comes from the non-rational side, then from profound organizational change, your own experiences with change, and then from direct contact with the generative capacities of nature. What do we learn from them? These are the things that are underlying what this process of going down the U and then going up the U is all about. But again, the reality sets in when we'll look at this concept of absencing, which is extremely important to understand, because that's the negative side of presencing. So this is basically, what I wanted to make sure that, that you had a chance to at least hear this, as opposed to what you're reading, and to listen to Otto and what those three divides are. So that's basically what my conclusions were from last week. And just want to know, Ed, do you have any, need any clarifications, any other thoughts about this? I know it's a lot, adding on top of what you did last week, what you're reading this week, and, kind of digesting this stuff. But I'd like you to digest it in the context of what's going on in our current reality, because this is very interesting times that are happening for us in the country, and and as Morley says, in the entire world. There is something interesting going on, and this U process is kind of an interesting tool to think about it. So, any concluding thoughts from you guys? So, none being heard, I'm going to stop the record, and I will tell you to say good night, and that's basically it for me from this point of view. And I'm looking for where you stop the record.